Okay, so everybody, welcome once again to the Methods and Approaches class, and I'm really excited to for today's session. I think I always like, because I mean this is one of the topics I really like to talk about, which is the idea of literacy and what literacy means and what literacy is all about. So today I'm going to give you a quick rundown. And again, it's important to point out that the ideas I'm going to mention with you, I'm going to mention this afternoon, uh, these are things that it's just a very brief introduction to a very large field, a field that I myself have been working on for at least a good 15, 16 years formally, even more in general, like formally as a researcher, as a scholar, as a teacher, as a writer. And it's a topic that once you get into this, you find the potential as a field of study, even in the field of, in the area of language studies and language education. So I'm just going to give you a quick rundown about what the field is about. Um, what is this going on here? Okay. Beginning with one thing, and I always like to use this the famous Inigo Montoya meme, and it's important to point out that a lot of people sometimes use the word literacy, and sometimes I wonder how people use it and what they mean by it. So today we're going to clarify one a very current interpretation of literacy, one that, and we'll give a little bit of historical background to that. At any point during the presentation, if you have questions, just feel free to either write them in the chat or just raise your hand, and the microphone will be yours. All the important thing sometimes, and this is to help people, sometimes there are different ways to pronounce literacy, but the most common one that it's literacy, like it's 4 syllables. So just so you know. Now, I want everybody to take a look at this headline. This is an old headline that came out a few years ago and on the local newspaper. And for the ones who are, because I mean this video I may put it on YouTube later. So I'll just read the headline. It says, with digital tablets, they will alphabetize 3,600 indigenous people in Guinea. So I want you to think for 1 second what you would think is problematic or questions you would raise about this particular headline. Think about what you could see is like problematic here. Again, you can raise your hand or you can just put comments in the chat. Either way works. Any thoughts? Okay, there is something here in the chat. Let's see. They don't know how to use it. Okay, yes, it's true, but it goes deeper. You go deeper than that. Go deeper than the use of the tablet. Go a little deeper than that, because I mean, the issue is, yes, there is the issue of the use, but and let's even think about this in light of the current of the discussions we've been having, and particularly think about this part, and then of course think about this. And as you think about those things, there are some particular, okay, let's see another chat. Aha, there you go. That's a very good thought. Very good thought, Laura. Yes, that feel that we have to civilize them. That is where it begins to get problematic. That is where it begins to get problematic. It's this assumption, it's the underlying assumption in a headline like this that indigenous people need to learn to read and write. That is problematic, because then we have this idea that, or we go with the assumption that they don't know how to read and write, that they need to learn to read and write. And instead of interrogating, instead of beginning with the question about what the practices with language look like, we begin from this notion that they're blank slates, that they need to be taught, they need to be educated, as opposed to let's begin from what they know, and from there let's introduce other forms of reading and writing. There is another issue that we have seen in our conversations, and it's again the emphasis on this emphasis on the technology, this emphasis on, oh, the tablet alone will solve the problem. And as we've been having discussions in the class, in light of this recent shift to the remote and the digital and the online and the virtual, and that it's beginning to raise an issue that not everybody has connectivity, that yes, you can get the tablet, but do you have the external conditions? Are the external conditions proper for the use of the tablet? So it's this problem of kind of thinking that the tablet is the solution to all the problems, that just by introducing the tablet, things will get automatically better. That is one of those things that becomes problematic when you look at this particular, at a headline like this.
Senor?
Yes. Yes. Did somebody say something?
Sorry, I don't know that I have the microphone.
Oh, it's okay. Don't worry, Raquel. You're muted now. It's okay. Everybody should be muted by now, so it's all good. So those are some of the issues I want you to, and as I continue the conversation, we're gonna be looking back at this particular headline and reproblematizing that. So as we see this, it's important to begin to operate with some assumptions, some particular assertions about how we're going to move forward from here on. So the first agreement, the first assertion we have to begin with is stop assuming that when I talk about literacy, I'm just talking about reading and or writing. That sometimes people say they literacy and they just mean reading, or they mean literacy and they just mean writing. No, literacy is something that kind of brings things together. And more importantly, it's understanding, going back to the ideas of Paulo Freire, that when I read and I write, those things are, they're connected. You cannot separate reading from writing. That sometimes for instructional practices, you can specialize in reading and you can specialize in writing, but you cannot teach reading without keeping writing in mind, and you cannot teach writing without relying on reading. So I can work on them, I can specialize in them for instructional purposes, but in a practical sense, reading and writing always go hand in hand. Reading and writing always go together. And that is important because sometimes we have talked about it, how you, in order to become a better writer, you need to know how to read. And in order to be a better reader, you need to know all this process of writing. So they're always together, they're always connected. And that is very important. that as I said here, one reads to write and one writes to be read. So there's this connection. I mean, we have always talked about that connection between reading and writing. That how reading leads to writing, and how writing it's always with the idea that people read us. That it goes with articles, it goes with social media, it goes with any comment we make. We want people to read what we say. And then this idea of literacy is transformative. Literacy should be lead to transformation. That is, that social practices can change as we introduce literacy, but obviously they don't change by themselves. But they can mobilize certain structures and mobilize people to think about the transformation of their societies. So with that, it's important to have a second agreement here. It's that when I talk about literacy, um, I'm also talking about issues of power, hegemony, and justice and social justice. It means we have to understand that language, from this perspective, language is never neutral. We've always talked about in this class about the most powerful weapon in the universe, that is the word. And in that sense, language is never neutral. Language always, as it implies meaning, it implies making sense of the world, and it implies making assertions and assumptions and working with stereotypes, creating, debunking stereotypes. And language always has an agenda. That is, when we talk, there is a goal for that. We can call it communicative goal, we can call it social goal, but language always operates within social agendas and with a social context. Language doesn't operate on a vacuum. Language doesn't operate in a space that is completely devoid or apart from the social setting. No, language actually feeds off of the social setting. Language actually feeds off of where you are. The way we speak right here, right now in the city, it feeds off from the city and from the people who live in the city and from the social issues that we have to deal with in the city. And in that sense, language, and we come again, going back to the idea of the most powerful weapon in the universe, it's language can be a tool for humanization, or we can use language as a tool to dehumanize, to break. So we always have to be very careful when we use words and when we send messages. And here is a comment in the chat. And it goes back into, yeah, thank you, and goes back into, and yes, and this idea goes back into the previous, in the headline, as Christian talks about. They're not considering they already have a language and it's not being taken into account. That is hegemony. That is correct. The fact that sometimes certain practices operate from the assumption that we have to teach them language and we're not respecting what they already bring to the table. That comes when we're talking about indigenous people, we're talking about linguistic or racial minorities, we're talking about elementary children in elementary school, at any level. If I don't consider, and I'm really gonna pick up what Christian said there, because that's a very good comment. If we don't consider all the knowledge and all the experience and all the life that people bring into class, or into a social situation, because all of that is language. If we don't take it into account, then what we're promoting is hegemonic views that actually correspond to a particular group in a position of power. So thank you for that. Very interesting comment in the chat, Christian. Very, very, very on point. And it goes much into this. So this idea of hegemony, yes, hegemony is that discourse that is promoted by the people in power and that intends to sustain people in power. So any discussions we have about language, we have to frame them around this, that there are structures that want to sustain certain groups in power. And that language has power because, again, depending on my position, I can use the words for better, or I can use the words for worse. So with that, as we said, language definitely is continuing with this. Language is not neutral. And we have to be careful not to fall into reductionist views. I mean, reducing language to one genre, reducing language to just letter, reducing language to just words, reducing language to, yeah, or to one kind of text. We have to be careful. And then also in the discussions of literacy, we're not just talking about language, but also talking about learning. So all these discussions we have in the field of literacy, they're also connected to issues of learning, what it means to learn language, what it means to learn in general. So they're not isolated from the overall conversation of learning. Okay, so after that brief introduction, now we're going to situate this conversation of literacy from a series of dimensions. So something that is historical, political, and social, and cultural, and pedagogical. So we're going to look at all these dimensions of literacy in order to understand what we're talking about. So let's begin a little bit with a little bit of a historical anthropological perspective. And I always like to begin that with one question. And the question always is, how old were you when you first started to write? And I would like to get some answers from some of you. How old were you when you first started to write? Any guesses? How old? Like 4 or 5 years old? I don't know. I think you were 4. Okay. So you say at 4 or 5. Now, let me ask you 5. Okay. Now let me ask you a second question. When was the first time you actually grabbed a crayon and you started playing with that crayon in a piece of paper? So how old, can you recall how old you were when you first grabbed a crayon or a pen or something that you can use, and you just started playing with that crayon in a piece of paper?
Maybe 5.
5 years old?
Yeah.
That late?
Yes.
Wow. Not just a piece of paper, but it was like 3 years old. Okay. Well, like a 2. Now, okay, Angie, now we're starting to get somewhere. Now we're starting to get somewhere. Like a 2. Okay, now we're starting to get somewhere. And yes, and hold on to that thought. Hold on to that thought as I go on to the next slides. Now, what if I told you that some of you may have started writing when you were 6 months, 1 year, maybe before 2 years old? That you started to write, and you're like, I think, and Mario mentioned the walls, and we're gonna get to that. So, first things, I mean, is everybody familiar with this? You know, the cave paintings. These are the oldest ones that we have, we know, I mean, some of the oldest ones that we know. And they're about 40,000 BC. And these were the first writings. These were the very first writings that we as a species have found recorded. And this was the first writing that we did. Now you're thinking, Raúl, but those are cave paintings. And say, yes, those are cave paintings. But when I say that these were the first writings that we did as a species, is because there is a story here. Somewhere in here, in this cave, in these paintings, there is a story. It means somebody left us a story, somebody left us a narrative. Oh, okay, Sumerian tablets, we'll get to that. Don't you worry, we're gonna get to all that, all in due time, Super Mario. But yeah, well, you're on the right track. Then think about, for example, this. Again, El Castillo, 40,000 BC. More instances of writing. That's correct. Thank you, Christian. Very good. We actually have that coming up. It's coming up. So we got Chauvet. Then we have Australia, and again, and you can see. Look at everything that's happening here. Can you see all that's happening in this one picture? Look at all that action that is happening in this one picture. And yes, Christian, we're almost there. Lascaux in France, and then of course Altamira. And again, look at all the action that we get here. Look at all what's happening here. I mean, look at all that action. Look at all that's happening there. There are stories, and the images tell us stories. The images tell us something that happened. And as we look at the cave paintings of past and way more past, we can those paintings can actually help us make sense of what society looked like at that time. But again, let's go back a little bit. And we have that based on the first cave paintings, again, and we're saying that in a line that it's we say we have been around, that our species has been around maybe since 100,000 BC, and right here, (2020 AD). So this is like the timeline. So I mean, give or take a few years. Our species has been in this neighborhood for a good 103, 105, 110,000 years. And so let's say somewhere around here, we have the first evidence. So this is 50,000, I'd say 40,000 around here. So around here we have the evidence of the first writing. It means we have, and again, we don't know what happened here. We have, so there is a possibility there is writing that is older than this, it's just we haven't found it. So it means at least as a species, we have been doing some form of writing for about 43,000 years. And a lot of that writing actually began on the walls. So Mario and the others, when you see children going to write on walls and that they begin to write on walls, that's just our DNA. That's just our history. Our history tells us we didn't begin writing on paper. We didn't begin writing on notebooks. We didn't begin writing articles. We began writing on walls. And 40,000 years of history in the larger time-space continuum is just a blink. So if you were 6, 8, 1 year old, and your first writing was probably on the wall, and feel free to ask your parents how old you were when you started, when was the first time you wrote on a wall? And they'll tell you maybe at 2, maybe 6 months, maybe 1 year. And as Mario says, in a piece of paper on the walls. Yes, a lot of us started writing on walls. It's just history. I mean, this is a lot of history and there is very little time. When you think about, and again, when we think about these learning issues and these issues of language, we cannot think about in terms of the time we ourselves have been here, but we have to think about in terms of the time humanity at large has been on this planet. Because as you begin to look at the issues at a larger historical scale, a lot of issues that we have to face with language today begin to make a lot more sense than issues about reading and writing begin to make more sense when you put it in a historical perspective. Like, for example, the difficulties people have to write certain genres. It's because we have been doing it for very little time, as opposed to the time we have spent actually writing on walls. Sure, some people call it drawing, but drawing is still a form of writing. It's just a form of writing that relies on images and relies on iconography, as opposed to the logographemic code. So let's go back to this. And then here, now we're in 5,000, around 5,000 BC, when we had the tablets, all the alphabetic codes. So that is going to be somewhere around here. Let's say somewhere around here, more or less here. That would be 5,000 BC. So it means technically, we've only been writing with alphabetic codes for about 7,000 years. Again, a lot of time from a historical perspective, but when you look at the larger picture, that is very little time that we have been writing using alphabetic and logographemic codes. It's just 7,000 years since the emergence of the first alphabet. So some issues that we are still facing with language, again, it's because we need to look at this from the larger perspective, from the larger evolutionary perspective. And then we have back in this story of the scribes, and I always like to bring the scribes because for a while, reading and writing, and this is where we have the discussions of hegemony and power, reading and writing were limited to certain groups of people. So certain groups of people have the privilege of writing, and writing was not necessarily an overly massive event. That we know the stories about people in the abbeys, or some people were in charge of writing, and some people had the privilege of writing and the privilege of reading. And then some people were denied that right. And we know historically, in moments in history where access to books was restricted to specific groups, to special groups, and not to everybody. A situation that kind of began to change around the 15th century, when we had the arrival of the printing press. And what the printing press did was somehow make the possibility of reading something that was more open and more accessible to the public. So think about this again. Remember that timeline. So 40,000 years, 47, 45, 45, 46, 47,000 years in the neighborhood that we have been doing some form of writing, but only about 500, or something like about 600 years ago, reading and writing became something more that was actually accessible to the public. I mean, fully accessible, that people could have massive access to books, as opposed to the restricted access to books that we had. And yes, the university, it's almost 1,000 years old, but again, there was a time that the university was restricted, and even more restricted than it is today. So when we start thinking about this issue of literacy and issues of access, then we have to understand that from this perspective, access to reading and writing is very, very recent. And that's something always to keep in mind. And again, you know that one of the first books that was printed was the Bible. Then we move into the present. And now in the present, what we have is we're dealing with all these new forms of technology and the new places and scenarios that reading and writing can take place. So now we have the internet, and then we have the presence of the different browsers, beginning with the first one, Mosaic, and then all the other ones that have appeared over the years, and the access of information that they provide. Then we have the emergence of multiple social networks, and here are examples of networks that have been, are still, are gone. I mean, some of them don't exist, some of them are still around, and some that are in this particular image. I mean, they maybe not. Maybe we have some that are not, that have emerged recently and are not included here. Same goes with different forms of instant messaging. I mean, there are some that don't exist anymore, like the BlackBerry chat, like the BlackBerry chat. Some are still going, like WhatsApp. Line had never really picked up much. Messenger is still around. And then we have also, when it comes to literacy academic networks, so we have Google, ResearchGate, Google Scholar, Academia, RightShare, Scribe, and all those. These also are forms of us accessing today different forms of reading and writing. Now, obviously, the question is, what's next? Well, really, what's next is a huge question mark. Like right now, I see a lot of people experimenting with, well, previously was Snapchat, now it's TikTok, and it's just April, so I don't know what's going to happen in May. And there are more, and now we have also questions about what it means to read and write when you're talking about video games, when you're talking about online communities, when you're talking about what happens in our neighborhoods, what happens in our cities. So there are a lot of questions about what it means to read and write. And even now we have to start asking ourselves questions. What does it mean to engage with reading and writing as an instructional practice and as an everyday practice in the middle of a situation like this? And questions about what other forms of social communication and other places for reading and writing are going to appear as the result of the current pandemic and what's going to happen in years after. So that little the initial introduction now leads us into the second point, which is this idea of looking at literacy as a social, political, and cultural affair. So the first consideration here is how we start looking at literacy practices as socio-political actions. So it means, first of all, understanding that historically there have been issues of privilege and access when it comes to reading and writing. That even today, we have a situation where there are certain places and expressions, especially when it comes to the digital world, that are, I mean, they can still constitute a privilege. The fact that we can meet here via Zoom, that we have access to computers and we have access to internet, and in this case, I have access to a microphone, I have access to a webcam, I have access to my laptop. That we have to understand that within issues of privilege, and that not everyone has access to the same tools to engage with reading and writing, and that whatever we do in terms of dealing with literacy, we have to really counter the existing forms of privilege, that just only favoring online over other forms may promote further privilege and further social inequities. Second issue is how our relationship with orality. So orality as that spoken word, as the oral tradition, as the spoken language that has permeated and has been part of societies for years. When you go back to those initial pictures of the cave paintings, what you see there is a combination of the image, but also there was a lot of oral tradition, and a lot of oral tradition that became the paintings, because then that was the way to record the oral tradition. Unfortunately, what has happened sometimes after the emergence of the alphabetic language is that some people have considered that the spoken language or the absence of written code becomes an inferior form of literacy practice. When what happens is the orality, the spoken word, the oral tradition is just as important as the written word, and they should complement each other, and they should work together. There is no one that is more important than the other. And this is particularly crucial when we're talking about, for example, indigenous populations where orality is the main form of transmission of knowledge. Some of them don't have written codes for multiple reasons. Sometimes it's because they haven't built it, sometimes because they just don't want to have one, or they don't need one. And the orality becomes the way in which knowledge is perpetuated in those societies. So we have to be respectful of that. Then there is this question about the idea of being literate and the idea of being illiterate. And it goes back to that, that initial slide and the comment, and again, the comments that you were making about, yeah, that disregarding the language they have and that is not taken into account, back to Christian's comment, that sometimes the idea of illiterate, yes, is the idea that people cannot read and write, but the question is, what can they not read and write? What can they not read and write? Because once you start expanding your understanding of reading into not just interpreting letters, but interpreting images and symbols and codes and body language as part of that, I mean, as part of a larger repertoire, where the word is still important, is still relevant. There are other kinds of codes that if I don't know how to read them, I may not be able to really survive. So we have to be careful in this idea of literate versus illiterate, that yes, it's important to teach people to read and write, but not by disregarding the knowledge they have or whatever elements are already present in the communities that they have, but as to complement what already exists. And then there is, of course, the idea of standardization and how there are efforts to create standard forms of language. You already had, and there is a chat right here. And I'm going to read a comment. Teacher had some discussions. One of our professors, Richard Oliva, how many schools take for granted already is something the students come with learning in their homes and their social. And yes, that's correct. One of the problems we have about not including orality as part, and some people separate orality from literacy. Some people consider that orality and literacy are actually integrated, in the sense that orality is just it's part of literacy as the spoken word, as the spoken language. That is very important. Disregarding the existence of orality or how people operate, because again, there are cultures that orality is something that really is restricted to families. And so some people, orality is something that they use on an everyday basis. But ignoring it just because they have to learn to read and write using a particular code, it's doing disservice to those communities. I mean, we need to find spaces for both of them to coexist as part of literacy. The literacy is not just it's the word, but it's not separating the spoken or the written word. In the word, both are equally important. The spoken word and the written word are equally important in the development of language and the development of multiple languaging practices. So that leads us back. Somebody's microphone is on. Yeah. There you go. And so that also goes back into this idea of standardization, that when you had a chance to read about world languages and world Englishes and English as lingua franca, that we have to be careful in the effort to create commonalities, not to create a structure so rigid that people are going to be excluded anyway. So that, because sometimes creating standardization in languages, it's also political. It means it corresponds to certain interests of certain groups or certain nations in preserving certain models and that everybody should conform to the models of language that they want to impose. When you go into a much broader and diverse form of language and languaging, then you have to really understand that there will be differences, and that these differences should be respected and appreciated as part of the construction of all those language expressions. Again, also, going back into the social and the political, understanding that language, as French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu always says, language is capital, and it's a source of power. It's a source of, and it can be a source of what you call symbolic violence, in the sense of the language I use, and for example, the languages I speak, how I use the language, how elaborate my language is, that is a source of capital. Because it means I am more quote unquote educated or I'm less quote unquote educated. And that is something that it can give me access to networks and access to information. However I speak, that has implications. Some people, and you see sometimes in that politicians use language as capital, social power. So that sometimes politicians go into more populist and demagogic language just to gain power, just to gain access, just to gain people's votes. And so in that way, language is also power. That sometimes politicians don't want to sound articulate or don't want to sound academic as a way to tell people you should vote for me because I'm one of you. And so that's what I mean language as a way, as a source of power and as capital. Understand that language is situated, as Brian Street always talked about. Where I am, where I live, who I work with, that has an effect on the language constructions I elaborate on a daily basis. Everything I am in my location, in my neighborhood, in my community affects my constructions of language. And then language is political. It's political in the sense that I can use language to talk about what's going on. And I can use language to express or raise questions. And the moment you start using language to raise questions, you start using language to express opinion or to interrogate what's going on in society, language becomes political. And then there are questions of, and these issues of access and audience. So who gets to have access to language? And who gets to have access to what forms of language? And who am I talking to, or who gets to hear my message? That makes all these things about literacy socio-political. That sometimes certain messages are not allowed to reach out certain publics, and that certain audiences get to hear all the messages, for better or for worse. That makes this whole conversation completely political. Hold this right here. I just want to do this. So then we have the pedagogical dimension. As we said, there are things related to learning that are part of this. So now, for example, a question we have right now: how do we read and write in a technological society? How do we read and write in a moment in history where the way we conceive society is changing? How do we read and write today when physical contact is reduced? When now they're telling us, no, you cannot have, you have to have this thing called social distancing that is basically physical distancing. How do we read and write when we have to rely on multiple forms of mediation to send the text? When the face-to-face communication is reduced? When the idea of sending you a message, of putting messages on different parts of the street is becoming more restricted? How do we read and write when there is the push for technology, when there is the push for the digital forms? And then the question of what frameworks and what ways of conceiving the act of reading, the act of writing are necessary in a society like this? What new forms, what new understandings of reading and writing are necessary when I am moving into the screen, when I'm not talking to you in person in a classroom, but I'm talking to you in person through a webcam? When I'm just looking at avatars and names as opposed to faces in 3D that I'm interacting with in my classroom? What does it mean when it comes to learning multiple languages and multiple codes? Because today's conversations are not happening in only one language. Even in different spaces, there are multiple languages at play, and there are multiple codes. You speak, when you use one of these, when you use your smartphone, you use instant messaging, you use WhatsApp, for example, WhatsApp is a medium that brings a combination of spoken word and written word that look like spoken word, and then you have the emojis as its own form of language, as its own code that has implied meaning. When you put an emoji, whether you put it as part of the sentence or you put it as a standalone emoji, that has meaning, and that has meaning in relation to the entire message you're sending. So those are questions that right now, those questions are morphing in our field of literacy is actually wrestling with those questions right now. As questions, for example, the question that we have right here, next question, the strategies we need in today's classrooms. And today's classrooms, this particular idea here, today's classrooms, this was a very different idea when I first worked on the first version of this presentation several years, 3 or 4 years ago, when I worked on the first version of this presentation. Today's classrooms look very different from the questions of today's classrooms today. So what does today's classrooms look like today? When today's classroom is something that is not a three-dimensional element that has 4 walls, it has the chairs, it has the students, but now it's becoming a more abstract construct. I'm not saying bad or worse, I'm just saying it's very different. The abstract construction that we are in a classroom, but this classroom has a different configuration. This classroom has a configuration where now we have to include some technological, in some cases, the technological elements, the computer, the microphone, the webcam, the PowerPoints, the teacher students in the role mediator, the students, and some of you right now, I don't know, in that today's classroom construction, I don't know where you're sitting. You could be sitting on a table, you could be sitting in the dining room, you could be lying on your bed, you could be sitting on a couch. Some of you are listening to this from your computers, and some of you are listening to this on your phones. So today's classroom starts looking very different. And the way today's classroom is going to look like in the aftermath of this event, of this pandemic, it's going to change. So today's classroom and tomorrow's classroom, I really don't know what it's going to look like right now. And I think that's a question a lot of people in the field of literacy are really need to think, okay, what will today's classroom look like once this is all over? What new forms of interaction are going to happen in today's classroom tomorrow? How is technology going to play out? The presence and the absence of technology is going to play out in today's classroom tomorrow. And then finally, there is this question of this very important question: whose responsibility is it to teach literacy? So whose responsibility is it to teach to read and write? And the answer is everybody. It's everybody's responsibility to teach literacy. Now, there are people who actually we have a field called literacy studies where we analyze these events and we analyze this. But when it comes to how getting our students and our children and our youth introduced to language expressions in our communities, in our cities, and in the world, it's anybody who's in contact with them. So parents have a responsibility to teach literacy. Parents are the first introduction students have to language, and students have to language in a social setting. So parents have that responsibility. And then teachers, all teachers have that responsibility, because we all have to deal with reading and writing. We have students who are dealing with, like in mathematics, there's a sense of mathematical literacy. You have to teach students to read and write formulae, and you have to teach them to read and write, like how you construct mathematical problems and how you solve equations and how you interpret geometrical shapes and geometrical figures. Social studies, there is a particular way of reading historical documents and historical events and reading maps and so on and so forth. Physical education, yes, they also have a responsibility, because I mean, if you think about the body as language, then there is an element in physical education where they teach you how to really move your body and not move in a way that is actually less hurtful and it causes you less harm as you grow old, for example. So the responsibility of teaching literacy is not something that is the sole domain of the mother language and the second language teachers. No, it's anybody who's involved in the educational process has a responsibility. It's just that we'll have different tasks. Some tasks will be more specific, will be more specialized. Like in the case of the language instructors, it's going to be about dealing with the sophistication of language, dealing with how to use language in a more articulate and sometimes more organized, and sometimes keeping in mind some of those rules of grammar and syntax. Others will just have to teach you how to read and write specific genres, literary genres, scientific genres, everyday genres, because there are multiple, and the curriculum covers all that variety of subjects. So let's just to wrap this up, what is literacy anyway? And one of the things we have to talk about today is not just thinking about reading and writing as isolated events, but what I personally have defined as the interpretation and creation of text. So this interpretation and creation of text, it's a much broader understanding of what text looks like. So the text is going to include the word, but it's not necessarily just written word or just spoken word. It could be written spoken word in concert with other forms of expression, with color, with images, with painting, with motion, with three-dimensional figures. I mean, like, and then when I think about interpreting and creating, it's really how I make sense of the variety of forms of communication that we're dealing with today. Second, the consideration that we have to transcend the idea of text just being print. Text is more than just print word. And we have seen it in some of you in your slam poetry, when you did the slam poetry assignment, you realized that you could use images and you could use music, for example, as part of the creation of the text. When you made your multimodal videos, your amazing multimodal videos, you realized that you could use color and you could use graphics and you could use that to construct a text that was richer in meaning and richer in interpretation. And then it's recognizing that text is social and personal. So the text I construct is part of a societal communication, but it also matters. It's because text is important because I created it and it matters to me. So those are three elements that are part of a construction of literacy, where you can see that there are multiple organizations and groups devoted around the world to think about what literacy is. Understanding also that literacy is very interdisciplinary by nature. So there is influence from psychology, from linguistics, applied linguistics, sociocultural studies, sociology. All of these fields have given us information and have given us ideas on how to understand how people create and play with text today. It's understanding that there are now more and more places where people are playing with text, people are playing with language, and that part of our responsibility is to acknowledge the presence of those spaces, to understand that the language that happens in the classroom is just as valid and is just as important, is just as relevant as the language that happens on the street, in the community, in the neighborhoods. That reading traditional forms of poetry is just as important as, for example, appreciating the value of slam poetry, spoken word. That the essay can coexist in the same area with graffiti. That writing traditional text can coexist with the creation of videos where students can develop the same sense or the same meaning to particular work. That there is a multiplicity of scenarios and a multiplicity of forms in which I can create text that we need to acknowledge and we need to open the space for, always with the understanding that all these language creations are socially situated, are socially ingrained, and that there are larger issues about who gets to read and what they read, who gets to write and what they get to write, who gets to play with text and what kind of text they get to play with, and what kind of text they don't get to play with. And that all of those questions are part of this view of social justice, where the ideal is that everybody, regardless of where they are and who they are, should have the possibility to access all the multiplicity of forms of text construction and use them as part of of this ideal of using language as a means to create a better society and hopefully better education. This ends the discussion I had for you. We still got a few minutes, so if there are any questions right now, I'll be happy to listen to you, and I'll be happy to answer your questions. That is a lot of information that was introduced today. And again, I insist, this is a very brief introduction to an entire field of study. I said, for me, this is my field. This is actually for students, my students, in case you were wondering exactly what it is that I do for my research. It's this. I'm a literacy researcher and a literacy scholar by training and choice. And I really like it. I always like to introduce this at some point so students know exactly what it is that I do, besides teaching the methods course. So I want to say thank you again. For everybody who's may watch this video later, if you have any further questions, you're welcome to let me know. You're welcome to communicate via YouTube. I'll probably leave my email somewhere in the video. So thank you very much, and everybody have a very, very good evening.